All right, thank you. This is a quick update on the GQL and SQL standards efforts. Although Oscar did steal some of my thunder.
Sorry.
But that's okay. Quick introduction. In this context, I am coming as the convener of ISO IEC JTC 1SC32 WG3, which is the database languages group responsible for the SQL standard and the forthcoming GQL standard. And I also do consulting and have been working with Neo4j Langstar. What I want to talk about today is a quick introduction to what is a standard, because it's sometimes helpful. I talk about standards as if everybody knows what they are and how they affect things, but it's worth spending a slide or two on exactly what a standard is and some of the types of standards. I'll spend some time on the SQL and GQL standards, not a whole lot. Talk a little bit about PGQ and GQL, and then what happens after GQL version 1 is published, because we've started thinking about that. At the end of the presentation, I have a bunch of extra material that I'm not going to go into, but you might find useful to look at on your own time. So essentially, a standard is an agreement between the participants on how to do something. ISO has a nice definition on their website, but the one way to think about it is that standards somehow benefit both businesses and consumers. For businesses, they make it easier and cheaper to both cooperate and compete. For consumers, that increases choices and the quality and the safety, and in theory, decreases cost. There's a bunch of organizations that set standards. I'll be talking specifically about ISO and IEC, but there's also the Internet Task Force and IEEE and ITU, which makes sure telephones work worldwide. A couple of quick examples. One that you may have seen is shipping containers. There's actually an ISO standard for freight containers that provides the classifications and dimensions and ratings. And the important thing about this is that it reduces the labor to load and unload ships and has reduced the cost of shipping goods worldwide. So there's a fair chance that something around you was shipped via a shipping container at some point. You possibly have run across wireless networks. This is specified by an IEEE standard 802.11, and I'll leave it as a quiz to read the actual name of the standard later. But the important thing I want to point out here is that in the last 20-some years, there have been multiple revisions of the wireless standard as things improved. So standards can be enhanced and can be expanded. We also have database language standards. SQL, which has been around for quite a while, and GQL, which is just getting started. The SQL and GQL standards are developed by a committee, ISO IEC JTC 1SC32 WG3. And if you haven't been around enough to remember all the parts, I've included a specification here of what the committees are and a structure. So essentially, Working Group 3 is part of Subcommittee 32, which is part of JTC 1, where most of the information technology standards occur. The original ISO standard for SQL was published in 1987. We've done a few revisions since then and expansions, most recently with SQL 2023 that was published on June 1. I'll come back to PGQ in more detail in a bit. Most of what you think of as SQL is really SQL Foundation. We have lots of other capabilities for various needs, and most recently, property graph queries in SQL. Did I mention that SQL was published in June 1 of this year? I have to say that I was really pleased to see it published. The GQL standard got started, was officially approved as a project in 2019. We are now at what's called Draft International Standard phase, or DIS. The ballot was initiated on May 23rd and closes on August 15th. While we're still not quite at the end, GQL is really technically complete. It's possible that out of the DIS ballot, we'll get a few more small technical changes, but nothing major. So the standard should be published in late 2023 is probably wishful thinking, so early 2024. One of the important things is that as we've developed SQL PGQ and GQL, we've kept the part that's called graph pattern matching common, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Venn diagram, for those of you who prefer Venn diagrams to try to show what the relationship is. So PGQ is part of SQL. GQL is a separate standard, but they overlap in the graph pattern matching. So PGQ, as Oscar mentioned, is property graph queries. It allows you to define a property graph view on top of existing SQL tables, which is actually really important because a significant amount of the world's data is in SQL. But then what you can do is to query the property graph view in an SQL from clause, which means that you've got the power of a property graph query language sitting on top of existing SQL data. A side-by-side comparison, GQL is a full database language. Stefan will actually go into that in a little more detail in the next presentation. But we've built GQL on the foundation of SQL and on the existing property graph languages, and we support both fixed schema and flexible schema variants. Quick example. The top example is an example from SQL PGQ, where there is a graph view called students graph. And in the SQL from clause in the graph table function, we do a graph pattern matching query that is match. In GQL, we would use a use graph clause to specify we're going to use the students graph. And the part of the query that's in blue is exactly the same between PGQ and GQL. Graph pattern matching has some fairly powerful capabilities for expressing patterns. We've kept it common because it's common and because SQL PGQ really stabilized last summer. Graph pattern matching has been technically stable for almost a year now, and it's beginning to show up in products. In particular, Oracle 23C has some of these capabilities. DuckDB from Amsterdam, from the Netherlands, CWI, I believe, is the institution, and Neo4j 5.9 that was released recently include some fairly complex graph pattern matching capabilities. It's possible other products do too, and then if other products have these capabilities already in them, please let me know and I'll add them to these slides. So PGQ was published at the beginning of the month. The GQL version 1 DIS ends on August 15th. I expect to see several hundred, 200, 300 comments on it. We should be able to resolve those DIS comments at the WG3 meeting at the end of September. If we make technical changes, then we might need to do an 8-week FDIS ballot. If we don't, it's possible we'll get the standard done sooner, but this should be published by early 2024. But if you're looking at implementing, the draft standard really is stable now. If we do make technical changes, they're going to be very minor fixes or enhancements of things that were really obviously needed in version 1. Next question is, what happens after GQL version 1? Last week, WG3 had a meeting in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., and we discussed a number of ideas for possible GQL enhancements. And I've listed the papers here. All of these have been posted as the LDBC extended schema papers. And so the LEX numbers and links will link to LDBC papers. The discussions included both WG3 and LDBC participants. In the room, we had, 10 or 11 people. Alistair Green is off on the right side. Some of you probably recognize some of the other players. But we also had a number of people on the web conference. So a variety of LDBC participants and various other participants were able to participate in this discussion on the web conference. And I sort of have to apologize to Denise because it's probably not the best picture of her since she was actually talking when I took this photo. So we have lots of ideas already. I expect that GQL users are likely to produce more requirements once they start getting products with GQL capabilities. We'll work on another version of the standard. The timing is going to depend on vendors' ability to implement capabilities in the products. I occasionally talk to product managers and engineers, and they always think that it actually takes time to implement capabilities in product for some reason. Mm-hmm. But once users begin to use the product, there's actually going to take some time for the users to absorb and actually to take advantage of the capabilities. And so the third variant, the third factor in how long it'll take us to expand is the participants in the standards process, because it does take time to actually write the papers to propose additional capabilities. So GQL version 1 is not the end. I mean, we've got 35 years of SQL. It would not surprise me if GQL follows a similar path. So we've had a number of editions of SQL that incorporate new features. The newest edition was published, and it includes SQL PGQ. GQL is a full property graph database language. And basically, it's technically complete, other than a few corrections here and there. But one of the important things is we've kept graph pattern matching identical between PGQ and GQL. And there's always version 2. Any questions? Sure, go ahead, Daniel.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So you talk about GQL version 2, but would it also be an extension to SQL PGQ in the future?
Oh, yeah.
Would that go hand in hand again?
It would, and I probably should have included a slide about that. We're also already looking at extensions to support things like cheapest path.
Right.
And
Yeah,
that's
that's one of the
being
things.
discussed in PGQ, but that applies to both PGQ and to GQL.
Okay.
Please here for this microphone. This goes to the Zoom audience. Yes. Thanks.
So I'm Oral Asla from AWS. I'm the chair of the W3C RDF Star working group. And my question is, you had a list of standards organizations and you somehow missed W3C. And can you comment on your view of W3C in this? After all, W3C published a graph standard about 25 years ago already.
Yeah, you're right. I should have included W3C. The W3C specified RDF and Sparkle quite a while ago, and over the years within WG3, we've occasionally talked about adding support in SQL for RDF style graphs, but never quite got enough people interested in it to work on it. That on my list, I'm not sure I've gotten it written down, but on my list for the future is to work on better integration between RDF style graphs and PGQ, GQL style graphs. I am not sure what that looks like because I don't understand RDF well enough, but I certainly would welcome input on how to do that and how we can better support RDF in SQL, for example.
We have some ideas about that, so I'll be talking about that tomorrow.
Okay, cool.